Everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Evolving Activist. This is Lauren Morn, and today is a super special episode. I'm excited as all get out to have these three people on today with me. We have Stacy Lopresti-Goodman, Paul Gorski, and Dallas Rising. All of them are co-authors on a study called Nobody's Paying Me to Cry: The Causes of Activist Burnout in U.S. Animal Rights Activists. I think this is an incredibly, incredibly important subject, and I'm thrilled to have us here. Let me just introduce them to you. Stacy Lopresti-Goodman has been involved in the animal rights movement since the mid-1990s. She is an associate professor of psychology and the director of the honors program at Marymount University. She teaches a variety of courses, including food, ethics, and society, and abnormal primate psychology. Her research focuses on understanding the enduring impact that confinement, social isolation, and physical abuse have on the psychological well-being of non-human animals rescued from laboratories. She also studies, alternatives to the use of animals in psychology education. Thank you for that work, Stacy. That's super important.
Thank you for having me on.
My pleasure. Paul Gorski is the founder of the Equity Literacy Institute. You've probably seen me share some stuff from that site, and EdChange. He's a lifelong activist spanning many social justice issues and conducts research on social justice education and activist burnout. And Paul, I love a lot of the intersectional stuff that you do. So that's something that we'll talk a little bit about.
Great, sounds good.
Thank you. And Dallas Rising. Dallas is a longtime ally of other species with experience in anti-speciesism education, hugely important, direct intervention, policy, and strategy relating to animal liberation. After experiencing burnout herself, she stepped away from direct activism and is currently teaching yoga and mindfulness with an emphasis on equality and inclusion. Also, hugely important work. Thanks, Dallas.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here too.
So thrilled. I'm super excited. I would love to have you all just come over for dinner one night, but you know, we're all over the country. So, so tell me a little bit about how you all got to be collaborating on this particular research study.
I guess that's a good question for me to take. I've been doing other studies about activist burnout, and started exploring doing something about animal rights. And I think Stacy and I had a conversation about it at one point about possibly doing something along those lines. And then Dallas and I previously had collaborated on a couple of things about, I think, related to like whiteness and the animal rights movement and other sorts of things. And so, I guess I selfishly thought, well, here are like two of my favorite people, so it'd be fun to work on something together. So I think that's kind of how it got rolling.
Nice. And I think it's a really important study to raise awareness and to shed some light on some very important issues. So will you walk us through a summary for those of you, and I will be putting the link to the study in the comments, but for those of you who haven't already seen me share it, would you mind giving us just a quick walkthrough of the summary of the findings?
I don't know who wants to take this one, but maybe I'll start. And
I think you should go. Stacey.
You can jump in. So we interviewed 17 full-time animal rights activists, or people who said that their life's work is their animal rights activism. So for some people, that meant that they worked at a large organization. For others, it meant that they were grassroots activists or volunteer activists. And what we were really interested in looking at was, what are the causes of burnout? What are some of the consequences and the symptoms that result from people who burn out from the animal rights, their animal rights activism? I don't know if, Paul, do you want to talk a little bit about how we defined burnout, because it was based upon your previous research as well?
It was actually, and my previous burnout research also used a definition that comes from Hillary Reddig, who is someone who's been involved in animal rights work and has written about burnout before. And she defined burnout as, in essence, when the physical or emotional stress related to activism becomes so heavy that activists involuntarily, in essence, leave their activism temporarily or permanently. So we're distinguishing that from like everyday uses of burnout, like, oh, I'm a little tired or I'm frustrated at work. But when the stressors become so overwhelming that in order to survive, I need to disconnect at least temporarily from my activism.
It's an incapacitation, right? People are incapacitated by it.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of extend on that a little bit, the other thing that I think is important to note is that burnout is not like a mental illness. So it's something that's very situational. So it's like different from depression or anxiety, or exhaustion or mental distress in those senses, that it's something that happens because of prolonged exposure to really difficult circumstances. So
I think that's a really important differentiation. I mean, it can probably result in some of those other things, but it's not the same. Yeah.
In this first paper, the one that you referenced, we primarily looked at the causes of burnout, and we found that there were three main categories of causes. And the first one was kind of internal psychological factors of just feeling overwhelmed by the scope of the problem, having this deep connection to animal rights activism, and just feeling like you have all this responsibility resting on your shoulders, and how overwhelming that could become. The second had to do with problems associated with organizational and movement culture, including a culture of martyrdom, which maybe somebody else wants to jump in afterwards and elaborate on. And then the third biggest cause of burnout had to do with within movement fighting bias and discrimination. And so those were the three big categories that we unpacked through these interviews.
And I'll jump in and just add that I think one of the reasons it's so important to document these different causes is that a lot of the popular literature about burnout and animal rights and other movements really focuses on self-care. And the problem is that I think most of the major causes of burnout that we found, like infighting within the movement, or how activists who work for big animal rights organizations are treated within those organizations, there is no self-care that can solve that by itself. It doesn't mean that I don't need to do some self-care to help me survive that, but the bigger problem of burnout and people leaving the movement can't be solved by that. And especially being able to document those sorts of things, like how some of these organizations, they know that there's an endless line of young, recent college graduates who would do anything to work for them. So they just churn through activists and to be able to document things like that, or the amount of racism or sexism within the movement, I think that was really important.
I think that's incredibly important. And, ironic to me that a movement like, for example, animal rights or any of the other social justice movements that are so about, ostensibly inclusion and equality, that they suffer from these systemic and systematic issues. Yeah. So was anything in the data surprising to you, or did you kind of expect to see what you found?
I think for me, anecdotally, it kind of supported what I've been seeing in the movement, unfortunately. For the past 20-something years, all of my friends are animal rights activists, and I love that. But it's unfortunate to see that this problem isn't just within this small sphere in which I operate, people who work at big groups, but it really was from activists who did animal rescue, who worked at sanctuaries, who did anti-vivisection, anti-racism within the movement. So for me, I think it was surprising just to see how widespread and how it touches every facet of activism.
Yeah, for me, I think because I came at this, came to this study at a really critical part or a critical time in my activist trajectory. So I am kind of the layperson who had not done a study before. I'm not a professor, but I was experiencing burnout and had experienced burnout. And so for me, part of the surprising thing is that I wasn't alone in this. I think I just, there was so much of me that was just struggling to function day to day, and this sense that I had really failed in my inability to stay, to keep going. Like my whole identity was wrapped up in animal rights work and activism and being that. Like that's who I was. It's not what I did, it's who I was. And so for me to talk with people and read the transcripts of interviews and see that I was not the only person who had experienced these things was incredibly healing and helpful for me at that time. And so, yeah, it was a relief, a huge relief. And I kind of expected to go into this thinking like, oh, it's going to be really hard and sad. But in essence, I felt a sense of community with these people that I'd never met because they described things that were so similar to my experience.
Right. So, and I think that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to tell people about this study, is to remind them they're not alone. I think this is a movement-wide problem, that we can heal from together, rather than having people feeling like that there's something wrong with me, or I'm alone in this suffering.
And I think like what Stacy had mentioned earlier about the culture of martyrdom that we discovered, there is an incredible resistance to acknowledging personal pain, I think, in the movement. And so not only is that happening, but there's an internal pressure that I experienced. And we heard from other activists too about that it was difficult for me because as I would come up against challenges, of course, I was always comparing my own struggles with the struggles of the victims of all of these exploitive, violent industries that we're working to, dismantle. And so I would think, well, I mean, it's just my habit of thinking, like always, like I go to the dentist and I think, this is really uncomfortable. I don't want to be here, but at least I know why. I'm here. I know why this is happening. I know these people are here to help me. I know, that I can communicate consent and not consent. And so when you start to when it's just as simple as going to the dentist and feeling like, oh, my discomfort here.
Right.
I mean, I'm just going to dismiss it entirely. You add on a layer of the sense of deep personal responsibility to do this work because there's a calling for it, or because you have an awareness of the vastness of the suffering and the scale and the scope, a deep personal commitment to start to think that your resolve is crumbling, or that my resolve was crumbling underneath that. I really felt it as a personal failing, as something that this is wrong with me. And part of that is just my willingness to take responsibility for things. But when we start to look into a lot of the problems stemming from dysfunctions within organizations within the movement, or the way that relationships happen within the movement, I think that there is a discrepancy in power there. And so people who have power, I don't know, I guess maybe one of you guys can help me, Paul or Stacy can help me explain this a little bit.
No, but I don't want to explain anything for you, but what I kept thinking of when you were talking about that is that it's one thing if we have that internal monologue in our head, but what our research showed is that people are verbalizing this to other activists.
Yes. Yeah.
Like, you have no right to be tired. You have no right to complain about low pay because the animals are suffering. And so it's not a personal failing. It is a movement failing, that we are putting the needs of animals above the needs of humans who are trying to advocate for those animals. Exactly. And maybe if we treated those human animals a little better, we could get more done for the non-human animals who are suffering.
That's such a great, Dallas and Stacy are both making really powerful points there. And it's sort of making me think about, there's a philosophical side to it, which is ridiculous if we're in this social justice movement for people to be treated so unjustly who are in the movement. And again, so much of the worst treatment that we heard about are coming from people who are in the big popular organizations. So there's a philosophical thing about that just seems so wrong. But there's also a very practical thing, which is we are literally shrinking the movement. We are, and because they're within the movement, there are so few supports. I think only one person we interviewed said that they were able to find support for their burnout within the organization or movement that they were in. But it's very practical because we're literally driving. In fact, there are people who we interviewed who are doing amazing work in the movement who are just not in the movement anymore. Just altogether just left. And yeah, I mean, well, Dallas is an example of that, but others as well were just like, this is literally destroying me.
Right. Didn't Gary Yourofsky had that same response too, didn't he?
What's that?
Gary Yourofsky.
Oh, I don't know.
Had to step away. Yeah. I have definitely noticed with some of the activism that I do, like for example, Cubes, and some of the outreach stuff, that it was surprising to me to notice how young in their activism everybody was. You know, like people would say, oh, how long have you been vegan? And I'd be like, oh, I don't know, 12, 13 years. And they'd be like, oh, I'm 6 months, I'm 2 years, I'm, you know. And I was like, wow, where's everybody who's been vegan for a decade? Where are they? You know, so it's correlating with what I saw as well. Yeah.
And I think back to the culture of martyrdom point, there are a few leaders in the movement who have been doing this for 30 something years, and they work 14 to 16 hour days for little pay, and they can keep pushing through it. So why shouldn't you? And I think it's this kind of trickle down harm that we're doing. And so not everyone can sustain that. So like Paul said, a lot of good people are leaving, like Dallas, and then there are more young people who are lining up to take their place, but we're not doing the movement or the animals any good if we're just churning through people. We're losing that institutional knowledge, the historical knowledge, the tactics that work, understand that.
It's counter strategic. Yeah. Is this, sorry, Dallas, you were going to say something?
Oh, I mean, I think part of the thing that's so difficult about that is that the process of burning out is essentially this process of losing your spirit. You know, I mean, so there's pieces of it, but it's like, as this is happening and you're experiencing this crumbling, and this sense of like this, I used to be this person that was really idealistic, and had all of this energy and hope. Right. And now I'm feeling like cynicism is creeping in and exhaustion is creeping in. I'm feeling more jaded over time. It makes it a little bit more difficult to relate to that fresh activist experience when people are coming in. So, and I experienced that too. Like when, you know, I've seen that over time, and I think that it's important to embrace energy and new ideas and possibility. But yeah, there is a structural loss that the movement is getting, because essentially like you're losing institutional wisdom as people are leaving. Yeah. And so if there was a sense of support for people, if the movement wasn't so hard on its activists, I wonder what activism would actually look like, because you need that fresh energy and that excitement, and all of that. But it's also helpful to have somebody who's been I've been vegan 25 years and I've
Right.
seen a lot of iterations of it. And I feel like when you do lose folks who've been doing this a very long time and have had literally thousands and thousands of conversations about these issues, there's something lost.
Exactly. Yeah. We're kind of we're starting from scratch. It's like 2 steps forward, 5 steps back, 2 steps forward. I have 2 questions that kind of came out of this. One was this culture of martyrdom. Do you think that this is unique to animal rights movement, or do you see it in other social justice movements as well?
It's something that I've seen in all the movements in which I've studied activist burnout, but I think it operates a little differently. One thing that, like, I did this study where I interviewed racial justice activists, and the thing that I think we found differently with the animal rights activists than I found with the culture of martyrdom is that in the animal rights, one is like Stacy mentioned, that her friends are all animal rights people, and I think that tends to be true of animal rights people in a way it's not necessarily true of racial justice activists. So there's that piece, and then on top of that piece, it's people talked about, well, I'm always around friends and all we do is talk. This is all we talk about. And so there's that piece. And then also the piece, some people in their interviews are talking about something that, nobody said this explicitly, but what it sounded like to me was that there's almost this competition, that burnout's almost a rite of passage in the animal rights world. And somebody will say, well, I've been up for the last 36 hours. And somebody say, well, I've been up for the last 48 hours. And also because everyone's friends with other animal rights people, and because there's this sort of shared culture of martyrdom, when people have a hard time saying no to their friends who want help and support with different things. So I'm exhausted. I've been up for 36 hours, but I just got this call about this action. And again, you might think, well, short term, that's great that people are getting involved, but that's not sustainable.
It's not sustainable. And
I think,
keep going, Stacy.
Oh, I was just going to say a few of our participants did discuss that. So they talked about how it becomes a badge of honor. I'm the most sleep deprived. I've worked the most hours. I don't make that much money. Everything I have, I give to the movement.
So there's a secondary benefit there, right? They're gaining something from that
status, social status, maybe, even though they're burning themselves out.
It's interesting because as you're talking, in the study, you called out the fact that animal rights activist burnout has a component of both the activist burnout elements and the vocational burnout elements. And as you're talking, I suffered from vocational burnout. I ended up having to go out on a medical leave from my job back when I was in the corporate world. And that whole culture of, I can tough it out better than you can. I did 3 all-nighters this week, and I haven't slept for 2 days, and all of that sort of stuff. It just sounds very, very familiar to me from a corporate perspective as well as from the activist perspective.
And we live in an individualistic society, right? So we teach people that you're the one who can help yourself. But as we see, this is a movement problem, and so we can't put the burden of combating burnout on the individual activist. This is something that the movement should be addressing, fighting, preventing, and helping support people who've experienced it.
So I have a question. How do you see activist burnout and compassion fatigue as similar or different?
Well, there are different sort of sets of literature on them from a theoretical perspective. I think they can be, I can see compassion fatigue as feeding into burnout for sure. I think part of that, one of that sort of internal part of the burnout, which is sort of like my identity is so invested in the movement, and I recognize the scope of the suffering that's happening. Like that part of it, I think, is very related to compassion fatigue. And also, some people have also connected compassion fatigue and that sort of stuff to what is that called? Vicarious trauma as well. But then there can also be parts that are direct trauma plus vicarious trauma. So for instance,
Right.
you have animal rights activists who are dealing with the traumas of being under surveillance or of experiencing different kinds of violence or of being arrested and framed as terrorists and
Exactly.
all of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So they might be dealing with even direct sorts of traumas in addition to, like, I know all of the suffering that's happening.
Right.
And part of the thing that happens there that I think is also a little different in the animal rights movement is that, and like when I'm in racial justice networks, like on social media, people aren't constantly posting violent
Right.
imagery.
Yep. That's a good point.
I mean, there is, of course, some violent imagery, and everybody knows what's happening. But in the animal rights movement, the volume of that imagery is so much heavier and vaster, and it's just constant. And some people's jobs are literally, some people within the movement literally have a job that requires them to spend all day looking at that stuff or working with that imagery.
Yeah. So the moral injury that comes along with that is, you know, I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking about law enforcement officers who are having to watch child pornography, right? And just how that constant exposure to atrocity just wears you down. I think I think the trauma narrative is a big part of this. But Stacy, you were talking about, this is a movement-wide problem. And what was interesting in the study was that the calling out of the animal rights movement is a lot less grassroots than some of the other social justice movements, right? So we have these big organizations. So there is an opportunity, if we can help shift the culture in those organizations, for that to have a pretty huge impact on the movement in general. That, and to your point, I think there's a responsibility there that they're abdicating right now.
One thing I would say, just as a little clarification there, I think there's actually huge parts of the animal rights movement that are very grassroots. It's just that they're not as visible. And in the racial justice movement right now, perhaps the most visible movement is not like a nonprofit organization, but it's like Black Lives Matter, for instance. So the movement is not built around these 3 or 4 big nonprofit organizations. And another part of the second next door study is those organizations are often fighting with each other. And so that adds a whole other layer of things. So I think there's a lot of grassroots work being done around animal rights, but that's not the most visible part of the movement like it might be in racial justice or other movements.
But I think one thing that might be important to say, these are just my thoughts, that it might be more tractable to address it at the organizational level, right? There are systems in place as where it's more difficult at the grassroots level. Right. And one of the common themes that kept coming up is that people felt overworked, underpaid, undervalued. Well, people who do grassroots activism, they might not be getting paid at all.
Exactly.
They have full-time jobs and then they have a second job on top of it. So they may be even more susceptible to burnout. And what is the system in place there to help them combat that? And so I think it comes down again to not personal responsibility, but movement responsibility to shift this culture of martyrdom to a culture of respect and care and support.
Exactly.
I'm
sorry.
So I feel like I've got something, and I kind of drifted away in my thoughts for a while. So I apologize if this has been addressed already or if it's out of left field.
That's okay.
I'm coming at you from Dallas world. But one of the things that that we were talking about, and I don't know what you said, Paul, that made me think about this, but there is a lot of racism and sexism in the animal rights movement, right? And so there's work that's being done by some people, but my experience was that trying to do that on top of I don't want to say the actual work because it's all connected. It is interconnected, but I think that that's the way that a lot of animal rights organizations approach this, is that it really just is one issue. And that's an non-human animal issue that we need to focus on. And so we put up with a whole lot, or as a movement, we put up with a lot of, can I say bullshit? I don't know if that's okay. But we put a lot of abuse, straight up abuse that happens, discrimination, a lot of violence, like in actual violence,
sexism,
overt aggression, microaggressions, all kinds of things. And this culture, it's tolerated because we figure like that's not what we're here for. We're here to deal with the animal issue and only that. And so it's like a breeding ground for a lot of folks who don't want to address their own stuff. And I used it as a way to not address my own privilege. I just used my focus on animals as a way for me to avoid having to deal with my white privilege for a long time. And then when I started to understand, especially within the movement, more layers of fuck-upness about that, the amount of resistance that I came up against was huge. And I wasn't the one that had the best tools to be a teacher. Like, I had a lot to learn because this had been the air that I'd breathed for a long time. But I could start to see that there were problems, and coming up against resistance to addressing those problems made it a lot more difficult, and was the catalyst for, one of the catalysts for me to leave. You mentioned Gary Yourofsky earlier, and there was like a thing that came up with me, like, wasn't there something that happened with him where he was called out for some bad behavior? And I that's where I disappeared, was like trying to remember what that might have been. But the point is that like, we have people that we put up on pedestals, and this has happened in conference environments, like where I've been one of the people who tried to hold the National Animal Rights Conference accountable for having keynote speakers who are known predators. And they're just like, nope, they're doing a lot for animals, so we're going to have their name on our stuff, and we're going to have them be a key speaker. And so, yeah, that's really alienating too. And we lose people to actual like violence, and not just burnout, because we have these cultures, these organizations, and kind of the relationship status, these hierarchies of people who do a ton for animals. They can get away with being assholes.
Right. Exactly. It's like, all that other stuff doesn't matter.
Or I came out that, I'm sorry if that was weird.
No, came out perfect.
No, it was important. Yeah,
okay.
important point.
I would love to share a story that connects with that. I feel like out of the three of us co-authors, I'm probably the one that's kind of most on the margins of the animal rights movement. I'm involved in other movements and kind of marginally involved. But a few years ago, I was on a panel at the Animal Rights Conference, the one that moves between, I guess, LA and DC.
Uh-huh.
And there were, I think, 4 of us on the panel. And so the guy who for a long time was the kind of like the seen as like the coordinator or host of the conference, a bunch of stuff had happened that was kind of weird. Like we had selected the order we were going to go in, and then he came in and just said he was going to go last, So there was already this weird tension in the room and all those sort of things. So 3 of us go. It was 2 presenters of color and me, and the whole panel was about diversity and social justice issues within the animal rights movement. So he says as part of his presentation that the key to eliminating all oppression is eliminating oppression against animals. If we eliminate oppression against animals, all oppression will disappear, which of course is an idiotic thing to say. I mean, eliminate animal oppression, rape is never going to happen again. That's just a ridiculous thing to say. But one thing I noticed is that there was someone else on the panel who's another really big name person. And there were people in the audience who were big name people in the movement, and nobody felt like they could challenge that. And later in the same session, a young woman, when we were doing the Q&A, stood up and said, "This is my first time at the conference, and I've noticed just being here some of the racist and sexist dynamics that are happening in the conference." And this same guy stands up and says, "There is no racism and sexism here or in the movement." Now, a young woman stands up and says, "I'm noticing sexism at this conference." And he says, "No, you're not." That's the response. That's the kind of thing. Now, we probably just lost her. She's not going to come back to that conference because the person who at least used to be the head of the conference has just humiliated her in front of
invalidated her completely. Yeah.
And I think that's what happens when these issues come up a lot in the animal rights world. And you mentioned earlier what we found most surprising, and I guess I wasn't surprised by this, but it is pretty horrifying. Every person of color we interviewed said that they had either experienced or observed racism in the movement. Yeah. I think not every woman we interviewed, but I think about 2/3, over half of the women we interviewed had been the targets of sexual harassment or sexual assault in the context of the movement. And I think, and so I'm glad sort of Dallas raised that to make sure that we touched on that point. To me, that's the most horrifying part of what we found. And the refusal of so many people who have power in the movement to address that, I think.
Right. Which is doing so much harm. I mean, it's a speciesist kind of approach, right? I mean, it's like only non-human animals count, and human animals, your suffering and your exploitation is irrelevant, which is it's ironic to me. Right. So, obviously there's a huge need for greater intersectional focus in the movement. I think, one of my favorite people that I follow on Facebook, their page is called Vegan Voices of Color. And I find that they bring up such interesting and useful information that really can kind of help me as a white person be a better ally to activists of color. Did any of the activists of color or the non-male activists that you interviewed, or any of the kind of the non-marginalized identity people, did they have any suggestions for how we who are privileged identity activists can be better allies to them?
We didn't ask about that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Specifically. But I mean, I think we know the answer to that. For instance, as a white activist, I shouldn't just sit and wait for for AFCO and Breeze Harper and Christopher Sebastian to just take care of all the racism. Like, I need to be, and they're doing amazing work trying to address these issues and these intersections. But white people need to call out other white people, and white people need to address the racism that's embedded in the institutions. And unfortunately, some of the highest profile people in the movement are just dismissive of any kind of conversation about any of this.
I just also want to give a shout out to Ariane Birdie, who's running Encompass, who's also trying to combat this issue.
Yeah, some important work to be done, but you're right. We can't leave it to the people who are who are basically being exploited and oppressed and discriminated against. We're the ones who have to take up that action. It's on us.
Yeah, my personal experience with that is going from an organization that really was very resistant to dealing with anything that was had to do with race, because it's messy and difficult work. And, I guess, yeah. So, and there's a lot of, anyway, I went from that kind of environment. And then after that, I did some consulting work with Vine Sanctuary, which is a queer run sanctuary in Vermont. And I was astounded when Patrice, one of the founders, sent out an email basically to the staff saying, hey, Martin Luther King Day is here. So your job is to make sure that you read a book or watch a documentary or do something to educate yourself about race struggles in the United States, and report back. And that was our work. And that was an expectation that was set and an assignment for everybody. And I thought it was incredible.
Yeah, that's just leadership, right? Yeah,
like as an example of something that an organization, I mean, granted, they really embrace an intersectional approach, but I was really surprised that happened. Excuse me.
That's okay. Hi, Oliver. He wants to come back up. He wants to be on the screen again. I'm sorry, I didn't actually introduce him earlier too. I should have. Oliver is Dallas's sweet little canine companion. So cool. So I have a question about turnover in the activist communities. You mentioned that there's an inevitable turnover that's accelerated by these issues. Do you think it's possible for somebody to be an activist for life, or do you think? I mean, my position on that is I think that people probably go through seasons of activism. What's your perspective on that?
I mean, I don't know if there's any data on that. So this is just, now my dog is chiming in, Penelope. I don't know if there's any data on that. I think anecdotally, there are people who have been involved for life, right? If I think back to my own lifetime of activism, I know people who were doing it then and still are. And I also know a lot of people who've left the movement. And I also know their activism has changed. So I don't know if there's a good way to answer that question. At least I can't.
I think my experience is that I've been an activist all of my adult life, and I'm 47 and still hanging in there. But I definitely go through some waves of having to take a step back, attending to my, to the impact it's having, and then stepping back in. So, but yeah, I think the turnover is a big problem. But I know people in their 80s who have been activists their whole lives, so it's possible. I think sometimes what happens is, and as some of the people we interviewed were in the process of leaving particular organizations and going to work for different organizations. Partially because of this sort of thing. So I think probably that happens, or people find different ways to engage or find different movements to engage in.
That's I think that's probably important, right? In terms of resilience building is to be able to step away and then, or to change how we engage.
I think the other thing too that I just want to point out, I mean, so I went vegan in 1995. And the way that I learned about veganism was by I was given a leaflet with some really bloody, accusatory, shaming language on it. And that's not the way that vegan outreach is done anymore. So, and for good reason. We had a different client, there was just there was different, but But, as a society, we grow and change.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested because, now the Black Lives Matter movement, was just coming into being when I started to feel really intensely burned out around animal rights movement, stuff. So I feel like the movement it's not going to stay the same.
Yeah.
It's the way that conversations are being had they're not going to stay the same. I was experiencing a lot of resistance to that change when I was starting to filter out of it. But yeah, I mean, and also like the first thing that I did in terms of volunteerism after leaving the animal rights movement was I decided that I was going to be I volunteered as a webmaster for my local city council person in their campaign, a trans woman, a Black trans woman. And I thought I'm going to be literally unseen in the background at home, and doing whatever I can to support somebody else. So it was a good thing for me to be able to do that. But, now I'm doing work with abortion rights and housing and equity with reproductive justice and things. Like, I think there's a lot of connections between all of this.
Oh,
So, yeah, I mean, and it's healthy too, for there to be some people who have more experience in another area to come in. And I'm hoping that we'll see more people who have a background with racial justice or environmental issues come into the animal rights movement.
I really hope so. I think that cross-pollination will be useful and valuable. You and I, Dallas, when we talked earlier, we were talking about, I guess, some of the unintended consequences of mainstreaming veganism. Can you talk a little bit about that and your opinions on it? Like, is it a good thing that we're bringing veganism into the mainstream? Is it good for the animal rights movement, or is it causing some of these other issues? Not necessarily the sexism and the racism, but is it creating a different philosophy around animal rights?
So again, just to be clear, this has nothing to do with the study that the three of us did.
Correct.
Clear disclaimer on that.
Yeah, I'm squirrel, right? Squirrel, I see something in
it.
it.
But yeah, so I mean, what I have seen over the years is, and something that that I struggled with as well is, I guess the mainstreaming of veganism. It's not that it can't be a mainstream thing, but I think like the biggest piece that I've seen is the commercialization of it. So we're essentially making quote unquote veganism into a consumerist movement. So, and granted, like, this has to do with, it does matter where we put our money and how we spend our money does matter. But it's becoming increasingly difficult to have conversations that are about speciesism. And it's also, and I understand why this is happening. I think part of it has to do with the difference between like a grassroots movement and organizations that rely on donors. They have to be able to supply quote unquote victories, or some kind of thing where that they can say we achieved this. And you can't, there's no tangible anything to steps along a path to undoing a bigoted mindset. So that's not a thing that you can write in your annual report and quantify in any sort of way. So I understand why, people turned in the direction of tracking products that are available and so on. I guess like, but yeah, I do feel like it's been difficult. I mean, it's been difficult to have those more deeply rooted conversations that have to do with oppression and systemic violence. And when we're focusing on selling people cupcakes, like,
yeah.
I don't know if that is helpful or not helpful, but And then the other thing too that becomes difficult is the more mainstream it gets, the weaker the message becomes, which is kind of the consequence of this, right? So we want to broaden the pool of appeal for the message, and then the message becomes weaker and weaker and weaker.
Right, it dilutes it and reduces it.
Right, and then we get emails from organizations saying that activism becomes pressing a button on your computer, and everything gets very muddy pretty quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, this is all so complex, and
not to say that pressing buttons on computers isn't effective at times. It certainly can be. Like, that can be a valuable thing to do.
Totally.
But in our age of social media, I think, tying back into the study, we create this climate where it becomes more about like an image, and the activism can become more performative than effective. And I feel like the pressure that can create can be a distraction, it can be destructive, and ultimately, like, it takes away, whenever you're performing, it's about you, and the work becomes sort of like the actual focus of the work is no longer on the community of which you're supposedly trying to work on their behalf.
Right. Huge. And I think that performance thing also contributes to the culture of martyrdom, right? It's like, you're only a valid activist if you're, James Aspey or Earthling Ed or something like that, which is, it undermines all of the work that the people who are not being performative are doing. Yeah. I want to finish up. I know we're kind of coming to the end of the time, and I could talk about this all day. I love you guys. But community care versus self-care as a way to mitigate activist burnout. What do you think of that? Like, how do you think that might look? And do you think that there can be, for me, I see it as kind of a two-pronged thing. I see us helping people to develop skills around self-care in terms of, boundary setting, communications, all of those activist skills, but being advocates for themselves. But then I also see the need for kind of the allyship and the corporate responsibility, if you want to put it that way, of the big organizations. What would you guys have to say about that? Who is that?
Who wants to go?
I heard a non-human have an opinion.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that we agree on as a trio is that this is not something, burnout isn't something that you can self-care your way out of, because it's just not possible to do that. So what ended up happening is that when my community failed to support me, I needed to leave that community. And that was really hard. So your question is like, what might concrete recommendations be, or what's
why don't we wrap it up with some, like, what are some tips, for leaning into this community care to be able to help us as a movement?
Well, I think in addition to thinking about, for instance, what do I need to do to take care of myself in the context of someone who's really passionate about these issues, I think we each also need to reflect on what are the attitudes and behaviors I'm carrying into this movement that might be contributing to other people burning out. And then I also think that the people who are leaders in the movement need to also reflect on what kind of institutional culture am I creating within this organization that might be contributing to the burnout of the people in the institution. My sense is that the heaviest stuff we found were, here's how I'm being treated by my institution, my organization, here's how I'm being treated by other activists. Or maybe it just feels big because we hate that that is a problem at all within the movement. So, how do we change the culture of the movement to be one that is nurturing the activists instead of destroying the physical and emotional health of not all activists, but enough that it's having an impact on the movement. So I think it's just about asking different questions. But I do think this also goes back, I can't remember whether Dallas or Stacy, I think it was Stacy who mentioned this, is that a lot of the people who are leading those organizations are people who, work these ridiculous hours and expect that everyone's going to do that for little pay. So I think we have to change the culture of the movement to one that values conversations about burnout, that values the sustainability of activists, and that directly confronts the ways that humans oppress other humans. That's got to be the new culture of the movement, instead of something that people have to go outside of the movement to find.
And I don't want to give us too much credit, but I think having a study like ours where we're actually talking to activists and trying to identify what caused your burnout, and then having discussions around that people can start to see how, like you mentioned, how am I contributing to that? Organizations can look at how am I perpetuating that culture here?
Yeah,
and
shining a light.
Yeah, and creating spaces for us to talk about it and not being afraid to talk about our own experiences. Like Dallas, who's saying, I experienced this, and I think it's empowering for other people to hear that. Like she even said, she realized she wasn't alone.
Yeah.
And so I think if we're talking about this, we're supporting other activists just by sharing our own experiences also. Yeah,
that's super important. Dallas, I think we'll wrap up. I'd love to get your thoughts on a path back from burnout.
So one of the things that I had said on the In Defense of Animals webinar that Paul and I did, and that you had seen, I believe, Lauren, is, so maybe you can put a link to that somewhere as well. But going back to that notion that animal rights community, people can be very insular in those communities, where all of the peer group, all of the social interactions are happening with others in this. Like, the world gets very small. My world was relatively small. And I had this feeling that I wasn't able to connect with people who didn't identify as vegan and who didn't think like me and hold these same beliefs and values. And that was my own limitation in terms of just me feeling like there's no way that I can rely on somebody because they wouldn't understand me. How could anybody understand me? But when I burned out and left, like, I was forced essentially to, if I'm going to have a peer group, like, I need to find other people. And I was incredibly surprised to find that I could connect with other people who did not identify as vegan and whose life mission was not animal liberation issues. So yeah, finding folks, like, opening up to the possibility that you can have people in your life who can support you. Maybe they don't understand everything, but like searching that out. So, I mean, so that was my path back, essentially. Talking about burnout is, I feel like I'm still contributing to the movement in some way by being able to do this. So I appreciate you inviting all of us on to be here in Defense of Animals, for helping, create opportunities for me to continue to show up. That's really wonderful. So, if there are people who are still involved and want to, people who are still in this movement and want to reach out and ask, like, I'm absolutely happy to show up and talk about this experience more. I can say that. And I've been really encouraged. I'm working with an organization called Our Justice right now, with a abortion assistance lodging program where we train people and do some vetting on individuals so that as abortion access becomes more and more difficult we can't get it because clinics are shutting down at such an alarming rate. I live in an area where we do have clinics, so people are traveling from out of town. And my experience working with with the people on my committee is like night and day from how my experience was working with other animal rights activists in terms of people being really respectful, appreciative, taking the time to get to know the other folks that you're working with, encouraging them and setting boundaries and having interests that are outside of this work. A lot of communication about what do you need from me? How can I support you? All of this I'm learning a ton about working in a supportive group. Yeah. So yeah, like maybe part of the solution to not burning out or coming back is by going to other places to get some activist experience where you're working with people who don't have such I feel like a lot of vegans have a strong negative feeling about our own species. Like there's a lot of resentment and frustration at human beings because we are the source of the violence that we're trying to end. And that gets generalized and starts to spit out sideways. And so if we can go and spend more time with people who really do love other people, then we can learn a lot from that.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's a wonderful place to stop. Everybody, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I am in awe of the work that you do. And I really want to get the word out and help people just, again, shine the light and give people hope that there is a way forward for the movement, that as we grow and evolve, that we can become a more well-rounded, more inclusive, more caring movement in general. Yeah.
Thank you for having us, Lauren. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thanks
really
for having
appreciate
us.
you.
Thanks for your podcast too.
Oh, it's my pleasure. All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.